Okay, so again, just to kind of go back mentally, I like thinking about what it is that we're talking about. So far, we've been talking about everything, and we still are from the perspective of lifetime planning for the parent. So, lifetime planning for the parent, healthcare. Living wills, you may have heard this term before. They're not legally binding. It's important to recognize this. So they're just a statement of wishes about what you want to happen to you, for example, resuscitation or not, and tube feeding or not, that kind of thing. That's what a living will covers. Statement of wishes only, again, it's not legally binding. Best to re-sign annually. We tend to do that with ours, just because it lets the person know, or whoever's looking at it, that you've continued to think the same thing, because our minds might change about these things.
Yeah, because again, this is a comfort document for the person who's making the decision. Do I tell the doctor to unplug the machine? That's a really difficult decision to make. And we use the living will, the guidelines for the healthcare representative, just as a document that helps that person make that difficult decision. But you can imagine if you're trying to make that decision and you've got this piece of paper and it's 10 years old, how do I know that the person even read this piece of paper? You know, people come into law offices and they sign stuff without reading it. It's horrifying, actually. I mean,
it's shocking.
It's shocking because I think, you know, I could be defrauding all sorts of people here because they don't read what I put in front of them, even though I tell them to read it. So if it's a 10-year-old document, how do I know that the person, but if it's been signed every year on the birthday, it just gives that person more comfort that, yes, I'm doing the right thing, I'm acting in accordance with that person's wishes. And that's the reason for re-signing annually. But you also need to speak to the decision maker. So if you're appointing somebody as your healthcare representative, they need to know that they are the rep, and actually they need to sign and accept it. But you need to talk to them. You know, you can have that written guideline as a reminder, but I think you need to talk to them about what your attitude is. If you have any religious beliefs that are going to affect end-of-life care, they need to know that, and it's better if they hear it from you. Now, if you're appointing your children as health care representative, they won't want to talk about it. They won't want to even contemplate something happening. But you need to have that conversation, and it's good to have it because, you know, usually nice things are said during that conversation. Oh, my kids actually like me. So that's important. I like this cartoon that Laylee found, and it's great. So healthcare directives.
Mm-hmm. So these are just basically what we've been talking about, the living will. The healthcare directive tells the person what your wishes are. Again, something that we think is useful to communicate verbally, in person, in consultation with one another, as opposed to just signing a document and then expecting people to rely only on that document without talking to them about it. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but you can have an actual official document that's called a healthcare directive where it's a checklist, and you can say, yeah, don't do this, this is okay, but don't do this. Now, you can sign that document and sign it and leave it with the healthcare provider. But the problem is that medical technology changes all the time. And maybe this was a horrible thing when I signed the document, but then 10 years goes by. And, you know, that's suddenly, that technique is now standard practice. And it's going to do a lot of benefit, but you've signed this healthcare directive, said don't do that. So we like to appoint somebody to make the decision, because then they can make the decision based on the current medical technology. And if you're in a situation where, you know, your only hope is this experimental technique that's just been developed, and this happened, actually, my mother-in-law, when we first moved out to the West Coast, she contracted hairy cell leukemia, which is a specific type of leukemia. And leukemia, it's not a good thing, but it was a very interesting leukemia that a lot of researchers were researching. And so there's this experimental technique that became available, hadn't gone through trials yet, so it had to be experimental. She took it, and she's still with us. You know, the leukemia went into remission, and so if it had been that she was in a coma and she had signed this healthcare directive saying no experimental treatments, that would have been precluded. So I don't like healthcare directives where you list this things. I think you want to give somebody the authority based on current medical technology, based on your wishes, to be able to instruct the doctor as to what to do, because things just change so much.
So that's where healthcare representation agreements come in as a solution to that particular problem. Healthcare representation agreements are documents that appoint someone similar to power of attorneys, and that you're appointing someone to act like an agent, and that healthcare representative can make healthcare decisions when you can't on your behalf. There's several factors that they can consider in the legislation, and one of them is your wishes. So that's where these living wills or the healthcare directive, I suppose, but more the living will document would be useful.
Yeah, I'd say guideline, because
Guidelines,
healthcare directives are a different kettle of fish. So I'd say guidelines. Now, the healthcare representation agreement is only for non-emergency decisions. If there's been an accident and doctor comes on the scene of the accident and you need something right away, the doctor's not going to say, oh, does the person have a healthcare representation agreement? The doctor's going to do Hippocratic oath, the doctor's going to do what needs to be done. So in an emergency situation, the doctor's going to do whatever needs to be done. This is only for non-emergency decisions where there's time to think about it, time to talk about it. So sometimes, you know, some people like to appoint a child, and you do have to think about, you know, is that a burden, too much of a burden to put on the child? You know, the doctor sometimes has to be able to take instructions from one person, but if you're appointing a child, then the expectation would be that there's a consensus among the family, because the worst thing that you can do is all the siblings are saying, no, 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 we have to, you know, have to keep mom alive until the very last moment, and then they put a guilt trip on the person who has to make the decision. So you don't want that. And again, that's a reason for talking about it, and you probably want to talk about it with all the children so that if that time comes, you don't have one child having to make the decision, being the bad guy, and the other kids putting that child on a guilt trip. That can happen. If there's no healthcare representation agreement, there's a statutory order of decision makers. Your spouse, your children, no priority among children, whichever child happens to be available. And some people decide to go with this. I think it's nicer to have the document, because how do you prove that there's no document? You know, if there's a document, then you can say, okay, here's the document, this is the way it's going to be, and this is the person who gives the instruction. If there's no document, then somebody has to conclude that there's no document. How do you prove a negative?